I want to start with a recapitulation about a theme that we have repeated throughout this study group, but we have not fully pinpointed or located or defined, which is the battle for recognition, the theory of recognition coming out of the Hegelian phenomenology of spirit in the Lordship and Bondage chapter. And I want to point your attention to Losurdo's fourth chapter in his Class Struggles book, where he focuses on the concept of recognition for Marx and Engels. Because I feel this is important, and why it returns so much in the Western Marxism text is precisely because you have a misunderstanding emerge regarding the socialist and workers' movement and its stated relationship to a battle for recognition. And the issue revolves around the following question: is socialism about a type of economic emancipation or a legalistic emancipation from bourgeois society? Or is socialism about the achievement of recognition, which is obviously qualified at a completely different level? And Losurdo's response, and this I think is very important in the wake of Louis Althusser and Louis Althusser's famous notion of the epistemological break that occurs in the young Marx, where, and Losurdo directs his critique to Althusser directly, where we have emerged a sort of mythology within contemporary Marxist thought from especially the 1970s to the present, that the mature Marx of Capital is no longer concerned with the theory of recognition as the backbone of his theory of liberation, that disappears. Okay? And what Losurdo tries to demonstrate is that even in the mature Marx, even in Capital, even in various political texts of Marx, including after the Paris Commune, the status of the question of freedom, which is ultimately what the battle for recognition, or the dialectic of recognition — I'm using battle and dialectic almost synonymously. I'm using battle in part because by the time we get to the anti-colonial struggles, right, this becomes a debate which we saw as most concentrated between Sartre and Fanon, as two, like a precipice. A division occurs within intellectuals about radical humanism, right, which is another word for how we interpret the meaning of liberation and of revolution. So Losurdo's claim is that it is a through line, that revolution for Marx and Engels all the way on through, even into the Second International, always has consisted. He uses the example of Auguste Bebel's Women Under Socialism, which was written during the anti-socialist laws with Bismarck. Obviously, it's radical social democracy period. It was written and published by an outlaw press, that bourgeois presses would not publish this material. And the argument was about a form of liberation of women that bourgeois society was preventing, that was homologous or at the same level as the condition of the wage worker, but they were shared struggles. They're not mutually oppositional, and there's not superimposed upon them some type of critique of subjectivity, which would say, well, no, revolution is ultimately about some type of legalistic demand for a better quality of life within capitalism. You see the point? So that the socialist movement itself never fully, of course, some did under Bernstein, of course you can say that reformist socialism broke from this type of theory of freedom and liberation. But the Marxist through line, including even with Engels, remained infidelity to it, right? This is Losurdo's claim. I'll give you a quote to back up what I mean. Chapter 4 from the Class Struggle text, he says, "The inadequate, misleading character of the purely economistic reading of Marx's theory of conflict is now clear. What is at stake in class struggle?" he asks. "Subjugated peoples, the proletariat and subaltern classes, women enduring domestic slavery. these very different subjects can advance the most varied demands: national liberation, abolition of slavery proper, and the conquest of the most basic forms of freedom, better living and working conditions, the transformation of property and production relations, an end to domestic segregation. Yeah? That's recognition. That's what we mean by recognition. So when Losurdo says that Hannah Arendt, that Horkheimer, that Adorno are looking out at the colonial situation, as we saw last time in Adorno's text, What Does It Mean to Think About the Past, I think is the title. We saw the same thing, which is a total foreclosure of a conception of recognition as even applying to the Viet Cong, to the Vietnamese struggle, okay? As even being relevant to it. But this was under the proviso of a Nietzschean theory of ressentiment, okay? Which we unpacked last time. Now, Nietzsche is going to enter the picture here through Foucault in a very interesting way in the sections that we've read this week. And we'll talk about that in some detail, because what you have to understand, of course, if you're not aware of Nietzsche's genealogy or of Nietzsche's very innovative historiography, is that it enters into the inside of the revolutionary tradition. Here I'm speaking of the revolutionary tradition beyond just Marxism, yeah? And attempts a type of paralysis on it is one way to think about the Nietzschean concept of genealogy, right? That's Nietzschean skepticism. That's another way to think about it as well. Of course, Nietzschean scholars will be aghast at the mere suggestion, but then you see emerge a very interesting contrast, because they then have something they consider to be a theory of liberation, which they often, as we were talking just a moment ago with Deepika, will renounce as, well, no, we still are included in something like the revolutionary tradition. So then you see it becomes an intellectual debate. We're going to talk about two texts by Arendt that are under consideration: The Origins of Totalitarianism and her text on revolution, published in the 1970s. Now, what's interesting, I think one was in the 60s actually, but what's interesting here is that Hannah Arendt becomes a pivotal figure in this text and in the grander narrative of Western Marxism, in the sense that Losurdo will claim that once Marxists, and this reaches its crescendo with Hart and Negri in their Empire series, once they accept Hannah Arendt's view on totalitarianism as plausible, Losurdo's claim, and you have to love him for the polemical status of this claim, I think, is that Western Marxism fully dies. This is the theory of its death. This is the moment of its death. So I think our task is to understand why. We need to understand why. And we need to understand what she's saying, okay, about the conflation between Bolshevism and Nazism. I mean, it almost sounds ludicrous, but just go back to the beginning, as I put in the Discord, of the third volume of The Origins of Totalitarianism, and you will see it. You will see the claim that there's no distinction between Lenin and Stalin. She even says, with a very bad citation, that Stalin said the only person that he trusted in the world was Hitler. She literally said that. Okay. And what you have here, also reflected in Losurdo's text on nonviolence, where he analyzes Hannah Arendt's theory of the civil rights movement in the United States, where she basically puts forward the following understanding of what is a valid revolution. And a valid revolution is one that works with existing civil society institutions and organizes classes accordingly. So therefore, she makes a distinction between the masses and classes. And she thinks, and this is in her text on revolution, that revolutions go awry when they are chaotically or spontaneously driven by what she calls the masses. And by that, she has very poor development, in my opinion, regarding what this means. It's basically what she refers to it as subject positions that are not represented by bourgeois institutions. So she has, in a certain way, fully absorbed and idealized the American Revolution as the revolution of modernity. And she casts aspersions of skepticism, profound skepticism on the French Revolution. And she wants to say, right, that there is a kind of normative direction, an avenue by which revolution should be thought, should be idealized. Eric Hobsbawm critiques her on this level. Many people have critiqued her on this level. So it becomes a similar problem, albeit differently, to Ernst Bloch and his absorption and celebration of the American Revolution. Now, of course, when we say that, we always have to understand the debates about the American Revolution, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Take, for example, the Hartzian school, one of the most predominant historical modes of interpretation in post-war discipline of history. Hartz's view is that the American Revolution was fully a bourgeois revolution, and he performs a liberal removal of the slave experience, as if the slave subjects didn't even exist. And this is similar to what Hannah Arendt does as well, right? And then celebrates it accordingly and shows that really socialism only came into existence in the American context after the class system of industrialized capitalism took off in the 1830s. That's when you have the formation of the two dominant party systems as we've experienced them since then. And that's when we have the invention of what he calls algerism, which is the bootstrap mythology, which would become meritocracy. It's a very beautiful idea, actually. It's one reason why you should read Louis Hartz. But I see Hannah Arendt in a very similar vein to Hartz, is all I'm saying there. And you could say the motto of Hannah Arendt seems to be no good revolution unless it is a bourgeois revolution. Profound skepticism regarding proletarian revolution.
Which is really what most revolutions have been. I mean, they have been revolutions of the people, especially in the non-Western world. But even in the West, I mean, depending on how people think about the Russian Revolution, whether it's the West or the non-West. But so basically, she's cutting out all revolutions other than the US Revolution. And that is one which did not emancipate the slaves. And more importantly, from my perspective, it did not emancipate the natives, right? So that's the other thing. So you have a set of, whatever you want to call that, immigrants or colonizers, then basically, revolting against the mother colony. That's what that revolution was. And that if that is her standard, that's a revolution, that colonizers against the mother colony and saying, gee, we don't want to do anything with you. We want to set up our own colony here, which is what they did. But the people who are really the natives, there's no word there. And of course, African Americans, absolutely not.
Yes, I mean, this is true. And in some ways it's disingenuous to juxtapose her with Foucault, because we know that Foucault's dissertation is a very interesting consideration regarding the birth of capitalism. And he inserts himself within that debate and shows in a very interesting way how the precondition of the establishment of capitalism in Europe, here I'm talking about his text, Madness and Civilization, was the subjugation of poor people, prostitutes, mentally deranged people, and so on, which is why he has that beautiful illustration of the ship of fools, like from the Grateful Dead song. It's my favorite part of Madness and Civilization, where the rational ordering of society meant to take the masses or the cast off or the lumpen proletariat and fully send them off to sea. But then they would return on these ships, and that was like a source of a profound spiritual jubilation. I don't know if you guys remember that part in the text. But Hannah Arendt is basically saying, no, proletarian revolutions or revolutions of the masses are psychopathologized. Losurdo spends a lot of time talking about that. They're basically they're characterized by madness, and that is what totalitarianism is. Totalitarianism is a revolution that has tried to sort of post facto organize society on the on the whims and the madness of the plebs. So the fact that elitism is disavowed in today's modern academy is a very interesting, that itself is an interesting psychology to think about why that disavowal of Hannah Arendt's liberal elitism still persists even by some Marxists, right? That's again going back to the Hardenegri support for which we'll look at in a minute. Because when Hardenegri do that in Empire, by the way, you may remember, you know what they're doing, that they're trying to like Michael Hart wrote that text on Thomas Jefferson and the American Revolution. So actually, I would actually want to open the space here for anyone to step up to discuss their perspective on because there have been some Marxist theories of the American Revolution. Perhaps people would want to defend the American Revolution in that way. I'm of a split mind myself. I agree in some sense with Hart's, but it's also very hard for me to. I mean, it's a fact that we lacked an advanced form of capitalism, and it is also a fact that you're dealing with bourgeois sort of migrants who are sort of like Shays' Rebellion is the closest we get to something like Babouf or the Conspiracy of Equality, right? It's the closest we get. But Hartz's position on that is that, like, well, it was very difficult to have a proletarian revolution in America because in order to have a proletarian revolution, you need decades upon decades, if not centuries, of forms of oppression that make themselves concrete in the society. So therefore, the demands of the American Revolution tended to be for the furthering of bourgeois rights. Sorry. Please, Millie, go ahead.
I think there's something incredibly valuable about what you're saying, and like a certain measure of extreme correctness in the idea that like the American Revolution, while inarguably a bourgeois revolution, was progressive. I mean, if we're talking about dialectics and the processes of development, was progressive insofar that it provided a process of delumpenization for the working colonist, like the what would essentially be the working class of the colonies, and also it allowed for black slaves to fight. So that was a material gain, right? Gave them guns, taught them how to use guns to a certain degree. It was the start of a process of delumpenization. So when we talk about the American Revolution, now I'm a Hispanic woman, I'm a colonized person from the global South. Like, I can see the American Revolution as a progressive step of delumpenization on a macro scale, which is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly. And also, of course, the way that the ideals of the American Revolution fuse into other revolutionary situations, including France and so on, is of great interest to me. The fact that Benjamin Franklin becomes a hero to the Jacobins is a very interesting fact. And it's a very interesting, like Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, has this idea of miscommunication or méconnaissance. And I think it's a kind of grand example of that, because the French revolutionaries were so enamored with the optimism of the American Revolution that they imbued it onto themselves. Go ahead, Evie. If I'm pronouncing your name right, sorry.
Oh, it's Evie. It's okay. Yeah, I know that there's a lot of debate within the American Marxist sphere right now. Sorry, I mean, I guess died down a little bit, but the main trends are between sort of Gerald Horne's counter-revolution of 1776 and this sort of like patriotic socialist rebuttal that also affirms it as a progressive step, but in a way that similar to Arendt and Foucault pretty much erases the colonial character of it. And I think the any approach, and Gerald Horne does a good job at being many-sided, in a way that the counter arguments don't, not all of the counter arguments, obviously, but just like the prevalent ones. So, because the patriotic socialism and MAGA communism, right? Their argument is we need the 1776 revolution to be able to stir people, right? Like we need to stand on the American traditions, etc. But I think that the way that they're doing that ends up trying to be like sort of be a shortcut to keep from having to address the massive contradiction of white supremacy. And so that's why I'm more inclined to lean toward the Horn argument, is just because of the absolute necessity of the American working class to have to squarely address colonialism in this way. And I mean, even the fact that Losurdo wrote this whole book about it and that we're studying it, that white supremacy and colonialism is such a problem for so many Marxists means that it's going to be that much more of a struggle to really get through to people who aren't, revolutionaries yet, and so I guess what I'm pointing at, and pretty much, I think that not to say it doesn't matter which side we land on, but I think it's important that whether you lean, toward or away from Horn's argument, it's important to show that bourgeois revolution could not and did not pretend to free the slaves, right? Or even want to, and that's, ultimately, as long as we're still pointing at capitalism's inability to provide, democracy for everyone, and pointing at the 1776 revolution as an example of that, and the following and ongoing racial oppression and global racial oppression that the U.S. is committing, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very helpful to bring in Gerald Horne. Did you want to say a little bit more about his main thesis for the benefit of others that are less familiar with it?
Yeah, I'm not going to do it justice. I'm going to screw it up a little bit. But basically, the argument is that it was a struggle for independence, so that they could preserve the power that they had over enslaved people and over the indigenous people.
Yeah.
And so I guess what it's pointing at is that it wasn't even really the ideals that were the driving force. It wasn't that they were actually fighting for democracy. They were fighting for their right to do what they would, and so, I mean, even Huey Newton, pointed at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and was like, we never got any of this, right? We have a responsibility to fulfill these rights as demands for everyone, and the system is incapable of producing that.
No, that's excellent. Good job. No, thank you very much. I don't want to spend too much time on the American Revolution, but it is extremely important to, I think, situate how Arendt is understanding the legacy of the Marxist theory of liberation and of revolution, because, again, just to repeat, and then we'll go immediately to Eric, Losurdo claims, okay, that Hannah Arendt portrays the Marxist position on revolution, right, in vulgarly economistic terms, which is similar to Adorno's casting doubt on colonial liberation as anything other than a kind of self-serving kind of gesture, right? That's what ressentiment is. That's the function of ressentiment, is to cast an aspersion at that level regarding collective agency, right? That's the Nietzschean narcissism point in a certain way. So anyways, go ahead, Eric.
I mean, I think there's a sort of traditional Marxist view of the three great bourgeois revolutions, English, American, and French, that tends to see it as a that there's two factions of the bourgeoisie, a more conservative one and a more radical one. And the more radical one is willing to make an alliance with the lower classes, like in the case of the English with the Levelers and all the communist sectarians of the day. And it's a similar thing, I think, in the French Revolution. There is I've seen a Trotskyist analysis, I think it's by Novak, of the American Revolution that sees it as primarily propelled forward by Samuel Adams, who represents, artisanal labor and small landowners and so forth. And that was the most radical element of the demanding a revolution, the most radical element, and also that had sort of the most far-reaching aims for the revolution as, transform social relations in the United States. And that he thinks that actually it was Sam Adams and his followers that were the most militant, and then they pushed the upper classes into active revolution. For what that's worth, I think also the idea that it was a counter-revolution to preserve slavery, which was also with the 1619 Project and all that, I think is pretty well debunked in terms of the evidence, that there's not very much evidence for that, but there is definitely, when it comes to the American Indians, it's in the Declaration of Independence listing the causes of the revolution, that the British are supporting insurrections among the Native Americans, and that was definitely immediate material factor of that the revolutionaries wanted to be, do as they will to the American Indians, and the British were at the time preventing them from fully genociding the Indians or killing them. Also, it's also possible to see the Civil War as the completion of the revolution, and that it's therefore, not quite accurate to say that, of course there was slavery at the time, and of course it wasn't challenged at first, but the ideas put in motion by the revolution did end up inspiring the Civil War, which did in fact end slavery.
Thank you very much. That's very useful. My understanding is that Horn is not directly aligned with the 1619 Project per se. Although that's a debate that I've been meaning to get Gerald Horn to come onto this program, and perhaps we could, because he is a great reader of Domenico Losurdo himself. So that might be an interesting, because we had been talking about who to invite to weigh in on this text. I'd like to hear from him. I think we should invite Gerald Horn. That would be good, wouldn't it? I see a lot of people saying yes, because we should get to the bottom of these debates. In some sense, it is, one gets the sense, right? Why is Michael Hart writing a text about the radicalism of Thomas Jefferson? Is it also speaking here of this concept of dialectics of defeat, right? In a world in which America emerges after the Second World War as a great hegemon, right? and the Pax Americana, how do you as an intellectual relate to the legacy of the radicalism? What is the meaning of the radicalism of the American project? This is such an essential question. And so I think we should invite Horn. I'm going to do that tomorrow. I'm going to invite him. Hopefully he can join us. I'd love to hear his thoughts on this and also to have him elaborate more on this question. Please, Jaira, please jump in.
I immediately thought about James Boggs and his book American Revolution, which is ultimately his argument is that the revolution was somewhat unfinished. He definitely grounds it within the critique of anti-Blackness, which he talks about as being a state of existing in an internal colony. But I would recommend What's Left of Philosophy's podcast episode on that text that I think it mentions that text called James Boggs and the Problem of Rights Under Capitalism. To kind of like discuss a little bit more about how he what he really imagined to be the fallout of the failure of the revolution, the American Revolution, to capture every segment of society that needed to be kind of mobilized. And obviously his work in conjunction with CLR James until their break was primarily oriented around how do we create a new American revolution. And he was an industrialist, but I think he was also, no, I know he was very critical of automation. So yeah, I personally don't have any strong opinions either way about the role of the American Revolution, but I know Boggs was like the first thing that came up when you asked that question, because that is a text I've read, and I find his work to be extremely compelling, and a really, really clear analysis of social and economic factors. But yeah, his book American Revolution starts on the premise that the revolution is unfinished, and he's hoping to galvanize like him and his partner Grace Lee Boggs dedicated their whole lives essentially to the question of like how do we mobilize specifically the American people to complete this work, understanding that there was a failure to reach the promises, as Eric was saying, of the initial revolution.
Yeah, that's really great, because in a certain way, one of the interesting points that Losurdo continuously critiques, if you've read enough of his work, is Alexis de Tocqueville. And you'll notice in the section on Hannah Arendt, Alexis de Tocqueville is the great, theorist of the ingenuity of the American Revolution as birthing a particular solution to what you might call the social antagonisms of modern capitalism through liberal institutions of civil society. And incidentally, that's exactly the direction that Hannah Arendt takes her analysis of revolution, right, into this. So it's almost like maybe you could call it a fetishization of the American Revolution that's going on with Hannah Arendt. And also, I loved the point that Losurdo made, is that Alexis de Tocqueville also saw socialism, right? In 1848. What did he refer to 1848 as? Apparently as the madhouse, letting go of the madhouse, like it's a psychopathologization of revolution. Deepika, please.
I actually wanted to move away from the discussion of American Revolution. Really don't have much to say on that. So I wanted to talk about something that you mentioned just a while before that, which was this whole discussion around, how is it that one moment in history is looked at, a moment of, emancipation, but by Hannah Arendt, it's looked at, that it's still trying to, hurt people and kind of dehumanize them. And that has to do with the Russian Revolution, of course, because she talks about Lenin and then she also blames Stalin. I think what is missing from what I could read in her text is there is a way in which she doesn't see that moment as one that actually through which people gain their humanity. So Marxism is not just about some economic, kind of equality and all of that, probably, which happens or doesn't happen, or we can keep talking. But I think what people do experience and have a sense of, and which is why they like this theory, however inaccurately they might, translate it materially, is that it speaks to people being able to, have that moment, what you're calling recognition, but I would say reclaiming their humanity, which is a very, very big thing. You can't take that away, and say, well, then what happened to your Marxism? Well, this was our Marxist moment, that we became equal, we became human beings when we were not treated as human beings for centuries. So I think there is that piece that she kind of doesn't seem to acknowledge anywhere, because it's all about. So I think this is also something I noticed once when I was in Germany. They want you to define what kind of a Marxist are you? Are you a Trotskyite or this? And I said, I'm none of that, because basically you're thinking about Marxism as a theory that helped so many people, along the way in being able to fight for their humanity. So, so I think that's the piece that I was finding that there was something missing there.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's a theory of a proscription of the achievement of freedom,
Yeah.
as understood, right, as entering into a certain form of liberal society. And I think that the argument, right, is that whatever happened in the USSR was not a sufficient development of liberal society. So therefore, it regressed to what she calls totalitarianism.
But then, sorry to intervene again, but Daniel, the point is, did they want to enter liberal society? That's the point, you see, because everything is like a prescription that you want to be that. But do these societies want to be that, or must we become that?
No, exactly. This is the question, I think, right? Which is the question that the Bolshevik Revolution has given to the world in some sense, but it's also the same, albeit very differently, I think, precisely because the bourgeoisie was very advanced in China by the time of the Communist Revolution in China, which was a process that happened over the span of many decades. In Russia, it happened shorter period of time, but still it was a protracted struggle. And still the bourgeoisie in Russia, if you actually study, the pre-Bolshevik socialist movement, stretching back to the Narodniks and Plekhanov and so on. I mean, yes, it was a czarist administration, but it also had a bourgeois class that had some degree of sophistication and advancement in its own right. So it's not as if you have a kind of highly primitive bourgeois society that you're dealing with there. I think that that's also and it's also, of course, completely neglecting what we've talked about in our second session regarding also the biggest blind spot, which is, why do they not acknowledge that Lenin now says, after 1917, the gauntlet should be opened for all peoples under conditions of neo-slavery? He would use the term slavery, okay, to imitate what we've done. It's an open invitation. I mean, in Losurdo's text on Stalin, the Black Legend text, the first whole section really focuses on Stalin's rhetoric and his speeches regarding the igniting of the anti-colonial wave of struggles, which I think through the prism of the liberal Cold War, right, Western intellectuals, including some Western Marxists, will then erase that initial radicalism, and they can then make a sort of judgment whereby they are taking sides, right? And their side is less barbaric than this totalitarian side, so-called. So I think that's ultimately what's kind of how it takes off. Connor.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. Just a couple of things. So yeah, on this question of recognition, like, is it so much, like, why does Hannah Arendt like the American Revolution so much? Is it so much of a blind spot for her, or is it rather that she likes the American Revolution because recognition is only afforded to some people, rather than this kind of radical sort of egalitarian democratic thing, right? And of course, in the American situation, basically, rights, citizenship are only afforded to those people who own land, own property. And yeah, you know, just a digression, like I was reminded of the last chapter in Capital where he talks about America, Marx, Capital Volume 1, that is. And it's weird. America's really weird because usually capitalism like gets launched through primitive accumulation, right? And this is the driving off of the peasantry. And where did the peasants go? They go into the cities to become wage laborers. That doesn't really happen in America. So you get, instead of that, you get just outright ethnic cleansing, and then substituting people on those land, you get what is the, you know, the fantasy to this day of the American dream, which is the yeomanry, right? Being self-sufficient on your own land, small business owner, right? So that's not really, you know, that's not really how things usually go, in at least in Europe. And yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about this recognition stuff because it's really interesting. You know, recognition I think of as like a privileged object in bourgeois political economy, right? The privileged object in bourgeois political economy is the citizen, and it doesn't, which doesn't say the individual who's afforded rights. It doesn't appear to me that, or it's a little more subtle what Losurdo was doing, right? Because it appears to me he's qualifying this recognition as operating on a collective level, you know, rather than the individual level. So like women need to be afforded rights, Black people need to be afforded rights, etc. And then alongside that, it seems as though we've kind of like been, you know, not dismissing this economic part, but I really enjoyed the parts where Losurdo just says stridently that all of these, you know, colonized peoples are trying to develop the productive forces like crazy, you know. So I just really enjoyed that because I feel as though that's sort of, you know, Western Marxists feel as though that's their specialty, but it's just like, no, like you can talk about it, but these people are doing it. So the long and short of it, really affirming collective senses of being and recognition that, you know, haven't read much anywhere else. So it was a good, I like that part.
No, you're right. We talked about it before as these two levels, and he made that distinction internal to colonial struggles for recognition, wherein the first one was a assumption of the casting off of imposed slavery from imperialism. The second one was a collective question regarding the organization of the collective will power to transition to a socialist economy vis-a-vis the development of the productive capacities. That involved geopolitics, because he even says that geopolitics is invented, I think, around the time of the First World War. So that involved a choice which, for the majority of the Western Marxist studies critiquing, they then could use that as a definitive judgment on Marxism, no longer being about freedom, but being about the establishment of economic necessity, and therefore about revolution as this individual. You see the point? They then can say, oh, well, you colonial subjects are just eager for material abundance. This falls back into the question of messianism, and it falls back into the question that Eric mentioned a moment ago around the petty bourgeois. Because just as a side point, I think everyone should also look at C.L.R. James's book on the American Revolution called American Civilization, where James, as a Trotskyist, does make that distinction between two forms of petty bourgeois. One is kind of on the side of proletarian liberation, one's on the side of alignment with bourgeoisie, by the way. And he shows the different seminal figures of the American Revolution that split this way. So that's an interesting side point. Excellent. Speaking of Eric, please jump in.
Yeah. Well, are you saying that are we saying that Hannah Arendt is a Marxist in the first place?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that she's providing a revision, I think, regarding the Marxist view on revolution based on in her work. I don't think that she's claiming the mantle of Marxism at all.
No, she doesn't, as far as I know. Anyway, but what she, I mean, you can see her in another tradition, which is, never mentioned in these discussions. I mean, there's a whole other interpretation of modernity as a non-Marxist interpretation, which is actually much more prevalent than Marxist interpretations, which is to see modernity is characterized as a mass society. So you can use the term masses is different than the term classes, because in a mass society, really it comes from Laban in its modern form. It goes back to bread and circuses in Rome, but in its modern form, you have Laban, who is never mentioned anywhere, anytime. But if you look at Laban and Nietzsche, there's a lot of correspondence. Nietzsche is definitely in the mass society tradition. He despises the masses and the ordinary people, and it's all about the transcendence of them. And Laban's crowd psychology posited the masses as a crowd, as a very dangerous element, as ruled by unconscious forces. He even says that their underlying motivation, they have an unconscious desire to revert to primitive communism. And so, and that's what, erupts in crowd eruptions. And Laban is trying to formulate a politics, an elite politics, based on the manipulation of the masses. And so when she's talking, when she's discusses totalitarianism, she's basically saying that's a kind of a mass formation, and she says it's run by, it's led by fanatics, those that, impervious to reason and truth and so forth. And all that rhetoric is very traditional mass society rhetoric. That's exactly what Laban was saying all the time. They're not rational, they're completely irrational. And he even devised a sort of a politics of the mass media, that you say that we can use the mass media and repetition, propaganda through the mass media, all these things that, have persisted thematically through the 20th century. He said it, and Marx was not the biggest seller. He wrote the biggest selling book of academic book of all times, was The Crowd. And yet nobody ever talks about him, but
Well, yeah, no, I did a nice program with Bruno Bostiels, the Badiou scholar, on a recently translated work called Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism by Leon Rosichner. And it's because, the person you're talking about is this guy, Gustave Le Bon. And he was really, politically speaking, he was like a pro-aristocratic bourgeois thinker, right? Trying to formulate a psychology for how to suppress mass uprisings, right? Yeah, so the argument, just if for those interested, it's one of the best Freudian Marxist arguments, is that Sigmund Freud, in his work Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, provides a systematic criticism of Gustave Le Bon. And Freud sides with the liberating potential of the masses. I think it's a beautiful argument. I'm convinced by it. I've read the book. So I agree with you. But de Tocqueville could be associated with Le Bon, and so could Arendt. So could Arendt, and so could Nietzsche.
Certainly, and also but Freud is he took, if the modern theory of the unconscious, which has a whole history through the 19th century, but in Le Bon, as I said, it's just kind of, inner, unconscious longing for community of primitive communism, and the inability to handle the individualism of modernity. And then Freud is the one that he personalizes the unconscious. It becomes a personal construct, and it loses its meaning in Laban as a sort of a mass phenomenon. Not a question of individual psychology, but it was a social psychological concept.
Yeah, this is really helpful because once we get to Western Marxists like Baudrillard, who's not mentioned in this text, what you find here is a very interesting kind of neo-Nietzschean skepticism regarding the liberating potential of the masses in late capitalism. So that always interests me, right? Which is that pessimist turn that is often neo-Nietzschean, that will, and we see some aspects of this in the Frankfurt School, although Frankfurt School diehards could push back on this, that they too have a pessimism regarding what, masses in revolt or something like this. And of course, all of this is deeply, it's actually a very relevant point for us to shift gears to focus on Foucault. Because one of the big things in Losurdo's criticism of Foucault is he thinks that Foucault puts forward a pro-Maoist but anti-Marxist theory of power, okay, such that it ends up in what Losurdo calls an esoteric populism. Because well, we'll elaborate it in a moment. I want to go to Evie very quickly. You're muted. There you go. There you go.
Yeah. I'm responding to something from a bit ago about and her assumption that they need to pass through a stage of liberalism. She's like basically substituting the ideological form for the economic base. That's what they're doing is they didn't need to go through, they needed to go through a form of state capitalism. They needed to go through a form of development, and that's this goes also to Losurdo, who has quoted Roland Boer about China's focus on economic rights as primary rather than civil rights, and how civil rights, flow from the economic. You can have all the civil rights in the world, but if everybody's poor, that's not freedom, right? And so, it's just basically, I guess what I'm pointing at is we can see how by erasing, by taking class out of it and by taking economic development out of it, the USSR wasn't totalitarian. They had economic rights that we do not have, right? And that's huge.
No, completely. And it's not taking class out of it. It's liberalizing the definition of class such that there's no affordance for the agency of a class of disenfranchised or completely exploited. It's in the same operation with Foucault, is that exploitation, the Marxist theory of exploitation, is removed from Foucault's, the thrust of his analysis of power. And precisely in the sense that what Foucault wants to introduce is a form of almost like impersonal socialized power that comes prior to forms of economic exploitation. This is tied into Foucault's conception of race and racialization, which we can talk about, but let's go to Millie very quickly. Then we'll talk about Foucault with some of our remaining time.
Deng Xiaoping said, poverty is not socialism.
Thank you. And that's absolutely correct. You would think that many American conservative critics of socialism would think that it is, right? Okay. So in 1976, Michel Foucault says in his Society Must Be Defended lectures, just to set things up here, says that the Stalinist regime and Stalinist persecutions, the Gulag, etc., were driven by a biological racism that dealt with mentally ill, with criminals, and with political adversaries through this idea of they biologized these others. Okay. Then he makes another point, which is that embedded in the discourses and the ideologies of socialism, stretching back to Blanquism, up through Marxism, anarchism, and everything after the Paris Commune, is an embedded racism that is inescapable. Okay. Why is this connected to Maoism? Partially because the French Maoist turn was around the time of the Cultural Revolution, and French Stalinism was the force that said, stop May 68. So French Stalinists, some of them, were perceived by certain leftists in France as sort of authoritarian figures, yeah, because they wanted to bring back stabilization, right? So if the Cultural Revolution in China is this experimental, ongoing process, how is it that Stalinists in France are trying to halt that very experimentation in France? So this, I think, is partially the thrust of Foucault's political concerns that drive a lot of his skepticism towards the history of socialism that is very important to understand. But Losurdo will then spend a lot of pages focusing on the turn to a theory of biopower, but also trying to understand what he ultimately cannot pinpoint in Foucault, which is why is it that Foucault, in his conception of biopower, neglects the colonial situation? And here I want to invite Foucault scholars to jump in. For example, there are a lot of Foucault scholars that have actually written on Foucault and colonialism, but it is true, and perhaps it is locatable in the very conception of the episteme that Foucault develops, that there's something about it which considers a discourse of power as internal to the empire or as internal to the core region, right? So therefore, if the knowledge power discourse mode that he develops, right, has an intrinsic Eurocentrism, right, what do you think he would say to Losurdo's critique regarding the ignorance that is brought to bear in his texts, or the absence of any conversation regarding the slave revolts, or can Foucault's theory of subjection and power, why is it not thought in the wider global colonial web? But those are some very valid questions, and I found myself scratching my head as well, given that I have read all of Foucault's major works. I had never thought about this absence. I wonder if you guys thought about it as well. In Foucault, one of the texts that has been very important to me is a recent one called Deconstructing Postmodernist Nietzscheanism by Jan Rehmann, which gets into, in a very interesting way, how, according to Rehmann, who I interviewed on my program about this book, here's the question. If, as I said before, Foucault's creating a conception of power and ideology and discourse, he's responding to this situation, as I mentioned, of French Stalinism. He's sort of sympathetic to Maoism. He is also against a particular caricature of Marxism, and he's developing a conception of what he calls a social ontology that is influenced by Nietzsche. And he calls this social ontology a social ontology of war. And he links it back to Nietzsche's genealogy, genealogy of morals, okay? And the creditor-debtor relation. So it's a sort of non-dialectical theory of social antagonism that performs a particular internal racialization and forms of struggle that take on this micro power form of struggle. This kind of so it's a an entirely new way of the management of social antagonisms and conflicts. Now, of course, we're just touching the surface here because Foucault's system is elaborate, sophisticated, and there's many layers to it. So we can spend as much time on it as you guys want. I just wanted to say sort of like a few things that sort of situate it. But basically, yeah, Raymond's basic point is that no longer are power relations structured on exploitation or on a model of appropriation, but they have the status of a intrinsic power source that is warlike and that situates subjectivity in a way that I think it becomes a question whether the Foucauldian theory of power, which Polancis, by the way, will criticize it. What will he say? He will say, ultimately, this is useless to socialist struggle because Foucault is theorizing power as omnipresent, as sort of inescapable. And therefore, you get the critique that I think Losurdo mentions, that ultimately Foucault's theory of power is this kind of transcendental. You know, it's just sort of, it's this this mesh of power. Now, I think, to play devil's advocate, right, I do find some appropriations of Foucault's theory of power useful, right? I think, for example, like some even of Gilles Deleuze's work has been interesting to understand, like the Control Society's essay. I gain a lot from that in this notion of the because I think the value of it, right, is to understand the interconnected linkages of forms of power across bourgeois institutions. But where I see its downside is that because it's so Nietzschean, you lose the recognition in the dialectics, and you lose a legibility of society as capable of undergoing a dialectical process of knowing itself as well. So the idea of the totality that Losurdo sees as essential to Hegel and Marx is obviously thrown out the window. Probably Losurdo chose the word esoteric because he confesses he doesn't understand its use for the left, you could say. He says, in Foucault, there is no trace of in Foucault's conception of biopolitics, he makes a beautiful association between it and Hannah Arendt's theory of totalitarianism, precisely because he thinks that Foucault is misapplying this conception of biopolitics to the USSR, to China, and he's doing the same thing that Arendt is, and also to not the Nazis. So everything becomes conflated, and there's no distinction between Nazism and these various state socialist projects. So that's obviously very but I want to invite Foucault people, if there are any on our meeting, to intervene. I'm not a good like defender of Foucault myself because I have a lot of struggle with his work. But obviously his influence is so immense. Okay, so Evie, do you still have your hand up, or is that from last time? I think that must be from last time.
Yeah, last time.
Okay, Eric, please.
I wouldn't. Why would not Foucault's concept of power be regarded as a kind of a metaphysical abstraction from, you know, a whole variety of situations in which he abstracts one feature of it and then makes all of everything, then he derives everything in society from that one feature, which is in the first place is an abstraction. And I think more generally that, you know, they're trying to theorize a non-Marxist, you know, like counterculture, you know, derive a non-Marxist countercultural theory out of like the 60s, where, you know, just to focus on economics in these prosperous societies was, you know, the focus became on everything, like everything was fascistic. And I was at the schizoanalysis conference that goes way back the 70s, and Deleuze and Guattari were there, and they were like putting up their feet on the chairs as a kind of protest against fascism, they said. So, yeah. But I mean, it's just a kind of, you know, that for the
Right.
60s, I think there's like not, you know, it wasn't enough to overthrow capitalism, but every aspect of life, of everyday life, had this kind of fascism to it that had
Right.
to.
No, it's true. And I think part of the interesting thing about Foucault, right, is that Losurdo spends a lot of time on, that it's worth looking at these passages, is that where Foucault identifies the introduction in European society of what would become scientific racism is actually as a response to the establishment of the Third Estate in the French Revolution and to the presupposition of the masses as a agency demanding for equality, demanding for rights. But in that, right, there's no question about the alterity of the colonial subject at all. The question that I will confess I want to know from a Foucault scholar, because I don't think Losurdo makes any claim that he's a Foucault scholar, because again, we should give credit to the depth of Foucault scholarship, and maybe we can even invite a Foucault scholar on to answer this for us. But what accounts for this esoteric refusal and ignorance regarding the colonial subject in his theory of race? We know that Nietzsche has a theory of race that Losurdo develops in his text on Nietzsche, which I can explain to you, that Raymond also associates with Foucault, but it's not race, it's racialization, which is that the masses, the plebs, this class that we've talked about before, right? Nietzsche will treat them as a racialized class. In other words, like for Nietzsche, the revolutionary masses should be thought as a racialized, like that's what race is for Nietzsche. It's immanent to, this is why, for example, Nietzsche is in favor of minorities, and you could say he has a type of perverted cosmopolitanism, precisely because what he wants is a society that's capable of generating a division of classes so that the plebeian or degenerate classes or weaker classes form a racialized other internal to that society. So society therefore has to be constructed so that that division will naturally produce itself. This is why Nietzsche has, according to Lukács, an implicit embrace of capitalism, because Nietzsche thought that some forms of capitalism can do that. Socialism does not do that. Socialism empowers that racialized class, but that racialized class is not racialized on phenotypical, or it's racialized on physiological grounds, but physiology is more than just biology. You see my point? So look, I mean, Foucault gets into all of those Nietzschean waters and sort of develops this war ontology and this theory of racialization. And I think Losurdo is right to cast some aspersions of doubt on it as a method. Please go ahead, AR.
Sorry, it's Akshay. But
Hi.
what was I? I mean, I have to say, this is the Losurdo chapter I sort of quite enjoyed the most, and I sort of shared a lot of the. That said, I also am very fond of Foucault, and I've always had this question of like why sort of there is no attention to kind of colonialism. But that said, I mean, I would offer a few defenses of it in terms of both its kind of like materialism and where I think it's kind of so I mean, I think it's interesting to note that like Althusser kind of like praises it highly, and like the big shift is kind of like with Foucault you have Althusserian ideology, but kind of without the language of ideology and taken as a so I mean and I think there's sort of two different things going on. On the one hand, like with his sort of the governmentality stuff, like I think it is a quite materialist approach, and so much as he's arguing that there are certain sort of like techniques of governance, right? Like the kind of like the panopticon or say a prison cell. And a lot of post-Foucauldian scholars, I think, have in fact like, gone to the colonial setting. And I mean, I guess like my weird ambivalence reading a lot of this chapter was that it's interesting because there are sort of, I mean, I don't know if I would call them Western Marxists or not, but post-colonial theory actually kind of, especially in its turn to kind of like, a broader category of the people. I mean, reminded, but in particular of like Partha Chatterjee, and I guess also maybe Spivak, who, both make very similar critiques, I think, to Losurdo here. But so I mean, I guess like because I think in Foucault's kind of like I think he's trying to redraw kind of Marxist history in sort of libidinal terms. I think like that's how I would read it generously, and that's how I read his kind of attempt to include sexuality and madness and kind of prisons and these questions as as a part of. And within that, like this kind of argument about race war as opposed to racism, I think he's sort of making an argument about sort of, I mean, we've been discussing the people, but how do the people come to be interpolated as the people, right? Which is the kind of, so for example, I mean, I think I mean, there's the Marxist theory about class and all of this, but like, why is it that it's like in the nation form that like, the contemporary sort of way in which the people are organized as a libidinal unit? Like, I mean, I don't know. I guess that's not quite articulate, but I'll stop there.
No, that's helpful, actually. I think, well, I mean, I would agree with you on the libidinal point, although Foucault does reject so much of psychoanalysis. He rejects, in an interesting way, actually, even the status of the unconscious, thinking that Freud, in the history of sexuality, is a sort of 19th century thinker. In that regard, he also thinks Marx is sort of in the dustbin of the 19th century as well. So look, I mean, Foucault has all of these various stages. There's all of these debates about that can be quite vulgar in modern academia regarding Foucault and neoliberalism. Is Foucault's turn to the culture of the self, his move to California, all of these interesting turns to Stoicism in his late work, right? Some type of fatalist, pessimist celebration of the neoliberal social order? Or is it a philosophy which is trying to equip people with the means to persevere in such a culture? I think the verdict is somewhat out on that question, and I'm not going to take a strong position on it. What I do think, though, is most correct is this problematic that we've identified from Losurdo and Rehmann of the absorption of a Nietzschean paradigm explicitly to eradicate Marxism.
Mm,
Marx remains
mm,
in the vaguest possible form in
mm,
Foucault.
mhm,
Marxism, I think, on the other hand, is removed to some degree. Where this becomes problematic, by the way, is that the most popular text, which we talked about, Ivan celebrated it last time, of Empire by Hart and Negri.
mhm,
Empire
mm,
incorporates a Foucauldian conception of what you might call this like post-exploitation theory of capitalism. And that, I think, is something that Losurdo will pinpoint in future sections of this text as a deeply problematic thing. It's almost like the point at where Foucault and Marx clash the most is the question would be, does Foucault leave us in a predicament whereby as intellectuals we can't speak about exploitation anymore or overcoming it? That's a question. Millie and then Jonathan.
I've been holding on to this for a solid minute. Okay, so like Western Marxists using biopolitics to like denigrate already existing socialism in China still happens today. Like, all right, I'm done.
No, you're right. I think you're right. I think you're right. But there's a lot to it, right? There's the question of racism. There's a question of biopolitics. There's a question of authority and what Eric was saying regarding, I mean, just read the introduction to The Guide to Non-Fascist Living, the introduction to Anti-Oedipus by Foucault. And what you'll find there is this theory of anti-fascism, which is almost impossible to operationalize because fascism is the air that we breathe. Jonathan.
Hey, yeah, thanks. I'm wondering if, I mean, maybe this is not entirely on point here, but I'm wondering about if, to the degree to which we can think about Foucault's interest in power as pedagogical or developmental. And in that sense, it seems to me that there's an interest in Foucault in the, well, let me say, the antagonism to the kind of repressive hypothesis that he talks about, that the idea that if you were to liberate yourself from social control, that you would be a free, liberated person, is entirely antagonistic to that. And it strikes me that if that is one of your core antagonisms, especially if you begin to align the masses with this sort of repressed element, that you're going to be antagonistic to various kinds of revolution as a mass revolt, and instead preferring something like a kind of very slow, long-term biopolitical development where states realize that their greatest asset and their only asset is their people, and that therefore they need to develop their people, which means essentially liberating the people, that it is in the interest of power to liberate the people. Now, I don't believe that, but I think that is sort of a kind of reading of Foucault that, I don't know what people would say, whether they think it's inaccurate or not, but that seems to me one of the ways that you can think of why he might be antagonistic to Marxism, is that it's almost, it relies on a notion of the oppressed as being, in some sense, when they become liberated, as becoming capable of governance. And he, so this is why I find sorry to go on, but this is why I find the Losurdo's point about how interested Eastern Marxists were in rapid development is, something that Foucault ignores to his own peril, right? I mean, that if you want to look at who is doing the most rapid development, it was the Eastern communists. Now, on the other hand, you could say that that is, had Foucault discussed it to whatever degree, it's a proof of a Foucauldian sense of biopower, where as soon as the communists liberate themselves, they immediately begin to think, how can we develop our greatest asset, which is our mass population? And they do so by industrialization and education, mass literacy, all of these things. So that's just a thought. I don't know what other people might think about that.
I like it. I like it. I mean, it reminds me of Max Stirner, the young Hegelian, who Losurdo is fond of citing. And he's kind of like a neo-Nietzschean figure, right? Who he functions as a gadfly in some ways to the revolutionary. Insofar as what he'll say is, well, yes, but your revolution is ultimately illusory. You're rebelling against like your own narcissism, right? That's the Nietzschean point, right? And now you're calling that pedagogy, right? You could call it counter-revolutionary, maybe. I see your point. It's also, I think, to be understood vis-a-vis this, a certain, like, these concepts of governmentality are interesting to me because, as I understand governmentality, it's like this theory of how civil society institutions reproduce the repression of the centralized state themselves. And so, in some sense, you could think of, you could charitably think of Foucault almost as like this gadfly internal to the left, right? Who's a constant critic of any presupposition to liberation. Maybe that's the only way to tolerate this figure, right? Because what is Foucault going to say about recognition, after all?
I mean, the only thing that I sort of tack onto that is that I think for Foucault, the liberation piece is only the first step, and he actually cares almost nothing about that first step. He doesn't care about getting, I mean, I think for Losurdo, for others, there's a real important interest in how do you bring rights, freedoms to large groups of people who are previously disenfranchised. And I think Foucault doesn't care about that problem at all. What he cares about are people, basically Western European people, who already have a high degree of civil rights or whatever. How do you actually liberate them, right? So those people aren't well trained in how to use their freedoms, right? Does that make sense? So it's a kind of post first stage liberation project, I think, that Foucault's interested in.
I think it's brilliant, yeah, and I'm 100% with you. Evie, would you like to build on this or make another point, please?
Yeah, I can't really build much on that. Well, because I've only read Discipline and Punish, which I did find useful in my development. I was like reading from an abolitionist perspective and trying to come to terms with the prison system. I was incarcerated as a youth, and so I was volunteering with a bail fund, and it was an anarchist who also volunteered at the bail fund who lent me the book. Now being a Marxist-Leninist, that makes sense to me. That sort of nobody deserves power because this is what power does to people, or this is what power is. That's the thing, is it's not really an individualist argument. It's more, this is what power does to society. It panopticonizes everything. But as Eric mentioned, it's an abstraction totally removed from history, and it makes the claim of always. But anarchists are notorious for this, and are the butt of many a joke because they don't get anything done, which isn't to say that the bail fund that I volunteered with doesn't do good work. They do. but they're not building for revolution. They are insisting on finding the perfect social formula or something first, through like a dogmatic insistence on a lack of hierarchy, which ultimately, disempowers everybody, because it doesn't allow us to build the sort of long-term, like, supple structures that we need to build revolution, and then to, take ourselves, to the next step on the task of, like, constructing socialism, right? Like this Foucault, like, way of thinking totally removes all possibility of that, just because it attacks the organizational form itself.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is very rich. Just want to say something very quickly, just so we keep some connection to the text. The other final thing I'll say, and just if people want to comment on this, is the section on Agamben. Giorgio Agamben, the Italian Heideggerian Foucauldian thinker, okay, who became very famous for writing Homo Sacer text around the time of the Iraq War, and is recognized as a sort of brilliant aphorist and essayist in his own right. I incidentally studied with him, so I know him pretty well. He was a young man that flew into Paris during '68, and then he studied with Heidegger as a young man as well. So he's very much a prodigal son of Western Marxism. And Losurdo chose one text to concentrate his rage against Agamben, which is a very bizarre text, in fact, by Emmanuel Levinas regarding Hitlerism, Nazism, and its relationship historically to Marxism, where it's the same concept here we've been talking about, which is very strange if you think about it, which is that Levinas argues in this essay that Marx put forward a theory that being determines consciousness, and that this idea is implanted into European intellectual life. And that itself, now pay attention to this, I was surprised to see it, that itself led to a type of racialization, okay? Because what Levinas apparently tries to argue is that Marxism would become a precursor to a type of social Darwinistic understanding of social being. And so therefore, Nazism and Hitlerism was a response to Marx's wager, philosophically, which, by the way, is very similar to the revisionist historian Ernst Nolte, who is a very interesting German figure in his own right, who has put forward the argument in pretty convincing ways that Nazism's primary enemy at its like ontological foundation is Marxism. Anyways, Agamben endorses Levinas's view, and this is tragic for Losurdo that he does this. And then he further, then I'll stop here, makes the beautiful point that this idea of Marx that being determines consciousness is not accurate. What is inaccurate about it is that it's missing a conception of society and history. Right? It's historical materialism, right? It's, you see, so he's trying to say that historical materialism led to this biopolitical, social Darwinistic conception of race war. So I think Losurdo is very right about that. I don't know if you guys agree. I think it's very problematic. But then again, Agamben himself is one of these thinkers who himself really moves away from Marxism. Akshay, you had your hand up, please.
That's okay. I kind of forgot.
Well, look, I mean, we've hit time. Here's my plan, unless there's other comments. Let's finish the text for next week. I think We've been taking it pretty slow. Hopefully that's all right. We'll have our final discussion on the text. And then, as I was saying, I will invite, Gerald Horn to join us. If he can join us on Tuesday, not the next one, but the one after, that would be amazing. But also we can have others. I know Deepika might present on imperialism or another topic. If anyone wants to do some kind of presentation, just send me a message. I also have an interview with Gabriel Rockhill. I'm happy to, maybe we could like bring Gabriel Rockhill here to discuss with the group. Or I can do it one-on-one. It doesn't really matter to me. But that's the idea, is sort of have a plenary at some point, once we're done. But let's try to finish it by next Tuesday. Sound all right? It was a good session. Yeah, it was a very interesting set of readings. Is there any other final comments? I really enjoyed it. Thanks for contributing, Jonathan, Evie, Eric, Millie, Connor. Yes, Millie.
Yesterday, I believe it was, marked 1 year of genocide in Palestine. And I think we should all take a moment to recognize that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so relevant to this question of recognition struggles, is it not? I mean, it's so pertinent. And I think what's interesting about it that I've been pondering is the plurality of class struggles. Plural means that we should never allow this discourse that's happening to pit anti-imperialism, this anti-colonial struggle from other forms of emancipation. That is what I tried to say in the second session that Lenin picked up, that imperialism does, that fragmentation of the left intelligentsia. That is happening today in very monstrous ways. You see my point? It's like a selective theory of recognition, or almost like a tiered, like, oh, well, we can only focus on this one or this side, or like somebody was saying, oh, well, I would only care about Palestine if it was ran by the workers and not Hamas, because Hamas is supported by Qatar. So therefore, they're ineligible for liberation. That kind of nonsense, That's exactly the pragmatism, I think, that is crippling the left, in my opinion. And the value of Losurdo. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's yesterday especially, you really got to see this struggle over recognition, right? Because who were the people that were primarily being mourned, in the, let's call it the mainstream media, right? It wasn't the over 100,000 Palestinians that had been killed that are being mourned, right? It was 1,200 people on October 7th, and that's terrible, obviously. But it rings tone deaf when you're mourning one group of people as opposed to this absolute heap of, slaughter on the other, and that's a question of recognition. Who is qualified as being worthy of mourning?
No, exactly. No, exactly. Like, I don't even know if Islamophobia is the right term to describe it, because Islamophobia genealogically was invented by, I think, like the British State Department. It's a problematic origin. I don't know if you knew that, because it's a subaltern. I did this interview, by the way, with a Gazan organic intellectual on my show, Mohammed Suleiman, who got his PhD. He got his PhD, but he did all of his schooling at the Islamic University in Gaza. It's a very enlightening interview, because we start off, I ask him the question regarding Norman Finkelstein's claim, which is very Losurdo claim, if you think about it, which was that October 7th was a form of a slave revolt. And I asked this man, who's my age, does he agree with that? If you haven't seen the interview, it's very interesting what he says. I won't spoil it for you. Akshay, please.
I remember watching that interview and I thought it was very good. I mean, I agree, like, slave revolt characterization is good, but that's it. I mean, throughout this entire time, I mean, there is this ambivalence of kind of like the Israeli funding of Hamas, and like, like, throughout the third world, you do have this like repeated trend towards kind of like, directly in opposition to kind of like communist movements, like other groups like, say, the Taliban being funded, explicitly with the aim of, say, fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess there is this like, this is not something, I mean, I guess this is on the internet and I feel a bit strange saying it now. I mean, in the sense that, given the current moment, I'm with Hamas, I'm for the struggle for national liberation. But there is this ambivalence about like, how did Hamas come to represent the Palestinian people? And that itself is already kind of like not apart from imperialism, right? Like it's, yeah.
Right, absolutely. No, I think we should talk about this in more detail. Eric.
I mean, do you want to say that, I mean, this is the primary basis of what's going on in the Middle East is a struggle for recognition? Or do you want to say that, it has to do with the economics of imperialism, with the control of oil, and with preparations to deny China access to Iranian oil in preparation for war with China? I mean, isn't like recognition seems like fairly weak tea to me, but
Yeah, I don't know, because I mean I think that the historical record on the Palestinian struggle and the Intifada and the decades and decades of its manipulation by outside powers and so on has always been a part of it. I mean, it's only been recently, after all, that Islamism became the ideological site for a dominant expression of Palestinian liberation. But according to my Palestinian comrades, Islamism is not necessarily the exclusive hegemon in the ideological field of struggle for Palestine liberation. They may have control at the level of power ideologically, but that is a reflection on the status of the flow of resources available to them. It would almost be like falling into that messianic trap that we've been talking about, whereby we would say, well, the Haitian slave revolt cannot occur ideally until it has the perfect leadership, kind of thing. I just think it's a lot messier than that. Yeah, I don't know. Let's go to Connor, then Millie.
Yeah, so I like the impulse, Eric, of course. It's always a good thing to go to the material, but at the same time, this question of recognition is also a material one. Very rarely do I put my cape on for Foucault, but this is a Foucaultian idea, even, right? This idea of like the author function, right? Like, and the whole idea of that is, a certain fetishization that it's only the author through which meaning is produced. Who really qualifies that? Who really like co-signs that idea? How is that idea created? It's created by the academy, right? And so like academics, really doing this fetishistic work, what they're doing is concealing how it's the academy and institutions like the academy, critics and so on, that are predominantly producing meaning, right? And set the tone for how it is that we understand text. So indeed, they get to qualify who is an author, who is in the canon, right? But by extension, they do this work of who is a victim, who is indigenous, and so on, right? And
Yeah,
a really good thing to, sort of illustrate this is, of course, what's going on at Columbia University. You know what I mean? That is the material struggle, grassroots struggle for, what the academy can affirm, right? So this is absolutely related to, you know, sites of power and consolidations of capital. This
No,
question
it's
of recognition.
totally true. I mean, it's been a question about regarding the propaganda of the portrayal of the Palestinian condition prior to October 7th that has been interesting to me, because some Palestinian public figures will make the claim that like, you've disrupted our life, we had a decent life, and so on, which undermines also the claim that actually life was never, since the blockade, since I think 2007, of Hamas, once they came to power, right after they were elected, 2006, I think. So that there are a lot of ambiguities. There are a lot of ambiguities regarding Gazan society that have to be parsed through the post-Arab Spring context, the changes after the massacre in Egypt, and Sisi's ascension to power. There's so many about the failure of the Arab Spring, the war in Syria, my God, the war in Syria, the hundreds of thousands of people that, or the fact that there are unknown numbers of Russian and Ukrainian men dying daily, not so much civilians, but like 1,000 Russians die a day into the war, which is a fact that's not even computed, processed, or examined in the Western media. It's even hard to find it on the internet. Try to search the deaths of the Russian-Ukraine war. You won't get clear information, I promise you. It's seriously censored. You see my point? The global situation is getting to a precipice of a numbness regarding these new imperialist wars. Palestine, I think, is a kind of testing zone of what the global community can endure regarding mass elimination of people. But man, you know, you allow for that numbness to persist and persist and persist, and then pretty soon new venues of war and annihilation will take place, and people are already preconditioned to ignore it. I think the left made a mistake when we were not adamantly opposed to, when we started to take a side with Russia or Ukraine in that debacle. That was a big mistake. That was a big mistake. We should never, I'm not saying anyone on this call has done that, but you see my point, because they're linked. You know, what's happening there is linked to what's happening in Gaza. I don't know if anyone else sees it that way. Go ahead, Millie.
I think it is incredibly incorrect to present Ukraine's entanglement with Western imperialism as justified in any way, actually. So
Yeah, well, I don't think anyone here is going to say that. I'm certainly not saying that. What I'm saying is that that we are in a new era of imperial warfare in which the population at the level of the mass media is becoming indoctrinated into a normalization of these wars. We know how that normalization.
I don't think that has been the case for decades, and I don't think trying to demonize Russia as an imperial power does anyone any service. I mean, I think it's incredibly harmful, actually.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that the Corbyn-Sanders wave should have empowered social democracy as a force internal to the core regions in Britain and the United States, so that an anti-imperialist flank could seriously be erected. But that didn't happen. That didn't happen. Things would look a lot different if it did. We are voiceless in that arena at that mass level through a parliamentary system, etc. And that's a big problem. And that's uniquely different than historically the socialists had a place at the table. We don't right now. It's a problem. Anyways, I think we should probably break. I don't want to keep folks for too much longer, unless there's any other final comments. I see Chris. Are you eager to jump in, my friend? No, you good? Yes, Evie, please, final comment.
Yeah, on the heavy censorship of the Russia-Ukraine war, I know that probably both sides maybe are playing with the casualties numbers, but given that how we've learned over the last year since the Al-Aqsa flood began, just how much our media lies to us, and really all of Western and NATO-aligned media. We should be taking a side, in my opinion, and that side is against the hegemon that includes the war machine that has enough power to shut that information down globally and to disseminate bullshit about it globally. The fact that the media consistently decontextualizes it and insists that it was an unprovoked war and that they weaponize like mental health tropes and say that Putin is just crazy and all of this bullshit, right? And they don't talk about Ned's role in color revolutions for the last several decades. They don't talk about the CIA in Burisma inside Ukraine. They don't talk about all of the CIA, all of the different State Department functionaries crawling all throughout Ukraine since before the coup in 2014 and definitely since, right? Like we should oppose the US and all of the NATO countries and all of the people associated with all of those NGOs systematically for, colonizing Ukraine and then turning them into a weapon and pointing it at Russia, right? Like it isn't that we shouldn't take sides in it. We should recognize that Russia is a target and was a target before the escalation, and that Ukraine, first and foremost, was a target of the U.S. and has been since 1947 with Operation Aerodynamic. And they've been supporting the far-right neo-Nazis that are now the Banderites. Right. So like this is not an inter-imperialist conflict. And it isn't that both sides are bad. We can say whatever we want about Russia. I see Russia, Putin, more like Hamas than anything, right? And you would not say we shouldn't take sides between Hamas and NATO imperialism, right? And if we were Russian, we would be looking down the barrel of NATO's gun. And so, yeah, we should take sides, or else we're just not going to take a side against NATO. And then we would be the Western Marxists that we're reading about.
Oh, totally. Or even worse, to fall into the Slavoj Žižek approach or to fall into the mega communist approach, which would take this, multipolarity theory and fall into side with Russia. And anyways, yeah, okay, we'll have a final comment from Eric and then we'll wrap.
Yeah, I don't think it's a question of taking sides, but to recognize that Russia is in a defensive position and it's not unprovoked. I mean, they were certainly deliberately provoked into the invasion, but that's very different than taking a side in favor of Russia per se, or you still have to analyze the class content of Russia and the nature of the government and so forth, but it's two separate things. One is analytic and one is cheerleading. And it's also, again, like I like, I like a lot of the stuff I read on the World Socialist website. I'm not advocating them, but they make a point that, for example, that it's because in the United States, right, you had this huge fracking boom and oil boom, and it's, the biggest boom in energy in history, and that gives them now the opportunity to attack Iran and also to deal with Russia, both of which are the top, in the top 3, 4 major oil companies, because they don't have to worry about upsetting the world market in oil, which would disrupt all the world economies. So, which is the kind of analysis I find very persuasive and useful, more than recognition. But okay.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. No, I mean, I think, aligning with solidarity with the axis of resistance for justified self-defense and all of that, I think is essential. But taking it to this other level of some sort of tacit embrace of an imperial nation state such as Russia doesn't strike me as a sensible position for 21st century socialism. But we can have that debate later. And anyways, thanks everybody. Until next Tuesday, onward. Enjoy the reading. We'll be in touch.